told to let you know I'm a first-time speaker, so hello. Okay, the paper's called Property Rights and Water Buyback in the Murray Darling Basin, and it's done also with David Adamson and John Quiggin. And it was done while I was it's based on my honours thesis that I did last year, and also work done in a summer research scholarship at the Risk and Sustainable Management Group that I'm now working at Aares. This is the quick plan for what we're going to do today. I'll just provide a bit of context so we can go through a little bit about state contingent analysis and the model that we're using, and talk about the scenarios and the results. So I've said that, and when I did my thesis, the result, the sustainable diversion that was in the guide to the basin plan overview hadn't been released yet, so it was a bit exploratory, just looking at the results when you apply different prices to water entitlements in the basin. But now that that plan's been released, we can do a bit more detailed work, putting in the targets for the different catchments and looking at how buyback might run. There was also a Risk and Sustainable Management Group water policy workshop in October after the guide to the plan overview had been released, and it asked the question, have we finally got it right with respect to water policy in the Murray Darling Basin? The general consensus was yes, we've got it right, in the sense that there's a strong policy orientation towards reallocating water from use and irrigation to being environmental flows, and that there's a big amount of money there to do it. Qualifications to yes included, to the answer of yes, included that we need a more detailed understanding of the type of environment we want to get out of this. We can't just say all water is good water and purchase it wherever it is, however we can. So we know that a buyback's going to be used, but there's a general feeling that we need a better understanding of the details of the environment we want, and then following that we can do analysis of how we're going to get it. So buyback has been in policy since November 2007, well before there were any targets published for how much water we wanted to get back in different catchments and throughout the basin. And they've been using a tender process to get it back every few months. They say we want to get some water from this place. People, entitlement holders, can put forward expressions of interest, nominating a price they want to sell at, and the government can either say yes or no. And I feel I should just make the point that there are no cuts in water allocations. The guide made this clear. It's interpreting the Water Act and all that, and the COAG communique, in that any reduction in the amount of water that can be taken from the basin is due to new government policy, and none of it due to new knowledge. So it's going to have to be brought back somehow. And they're implementing the minimum recommended reduction. 3,000 is around 20% of diversions, and that's what everyone's getting up in arms about, and we've got to think about. So state contingent analysis, if you're not familiar with state contingent analysis and the Risk and Sustainable Management Group's state contingent model, it looks at irrigated agricultural production in the basin using 3 states of nature: a drought state, a normal state and a wet state, and producers separated by catchments maximise expected profit across the states of nature, choosing among a number of different production technologies. And so using state contingent approach, we can look at trade-offs between states of nature, and that's particularly important in the context of irrigation in the basin and environmental targets that we have in the basin. And public analysis has focused on the sustainable diversion limits that are published, but there is actually a lot of detailed analysis of the particular flow events that are required to ensure environmental sustainability. In the technical background reports for each of the catchments, they talk about what's required for all the environmental assets, and they're specified these events in terms of megalitres per day for how many days, how many years in 100 it should occur, what time of the year it should occur, and how much you can split the events up and still have them fulfil their intended purpose. So there's a lot of work being done on this, but we need to talk about it more and spend more time analysing the particular effects of the environmental targets we have. And yeah, choices about how often flow events should occur and what seasonal conditions are precisely choices about states of nature that you want to have when these events occur. So state contingent analysis seems like a good place to start. So we've In modelling this, we've introduced options for producers to sell water entitlements. In my thesis, there are only two different types. An entitlement which uses water in the wet state, and one which uses water in the wet and normal state, so that's what the producers must give up in selling the entitlement. Now there's 3 different types of entitlements: high security, general and supplementary, trying to mimic what we see in the entitlement structure in the basin. High security entitlements always get water in wet and normal states, and 75% in the drought. General security a little bit less, and the supplementary entitlements only really get water in the wet state of nature when there's a lot of it to go around. And because the model's an annually calibrated model, the prices that we have for the entitlements in it are annuities. They're 20-year annuities with a 7% discount interest rate. And we've used the historic prices seen in the buyback, in the restoring balance in the Murray Darling Basin program, which are around $2,000 per megalitre for the high security entitlements. Okay, we looked at 6 different scenarios. Scenario 1 is just a base case, where there's no buyback, no environmental targets. The expected return to agriculture is about $2.5 billion in that one. In scenario 2, we've got there are no targets and no budget, so we put the prices in there and let it run. In that scenario, you get about 6,900 gigalitres expected returning to the environment, and it costs around $14.7 billion. So it's beyond the realms of what we're likely to ever see happen. But scenario 3, we put in the low targets, which sum up to, for each catchment, which sum up to around 3,000 gigalitres, long-term average, and didn't have a budget in there, and that comes out costing around $6 billion to the taxpayer. Scenario 4, same targets, but we introduced the $3.1 billion budget, which is what's currently allocated for water buybacks, compared to $5.8 billion for efficiency gains under the Sustainable Rural Water Use and Infrastructure Program, which there's a bit of contention about. Maybe some reallocation needs to occur. And in scenario 5, it's the same as 4, but we'll introduce an environmental target that we might want to achieve. A Coorong flow constraint of must have 500 gigalitres flowing to the Coorong even in the drought state of nature. And in scenario 6, we took a look at implementing the high targets published in the Guide to the Basin Plan, which are around 7,000 gigalitres long-term average, and it can be done with a $10 billion budget. I think we got it down to around 9,977 or so million dollars doing it, but it's around $10 million that would cost. So that also is way outside what's currently allocated for any buybacks. Just a few figures looking at what we've got. This is the average income. The water sales income doesn't change across the states of nature because it's just a sale, so the expected value of it is just what you get. But you can see that there are reductions with the buyback. Well, that hasn't come up properly, I'm sorry, but there's scenarios 1 to 6 that I noted before. The reduction when you introduce a buyback with no targets and no budget is about 10%, 2.5 billion down to 2.125 billion. And the biggest reduction you see in average agricultural income is scenario 6 there, where you spend $10 billion taking water back, and that's a reduction of about 25%. And that's why, you can see that's why the Murray Darling Basin Authority didn't pursue a detailed analysis of those type of reductions, because it's regarded as untenable for the social and economic impacts that it'll have. This is the normal state of nature. It's a similar sort of story. As I said, water sales income is the same. The amounts there are an annuity. For scenario 2, as I said, it's about $6 billion expenditure. Scenarios 3 to 5, that's the $3.1 billion budget constraint. And scenario 6 is a $10 billion budget constraint. In the drought state of nature, you actually see with the buyback an increase in agricultural income in that second scenario, and a comparable amount for scenarios 3 to 5, and much higher for the 6th scenario. So there may be some income smoothing effects possible as a result of purchasing water, depending on where you do it and how you do it. In the wet state, everyone's earning a lot more money because there's a lot more water available, but you can see that with the buyback, because of which entitlements are purchased and the change in production activities, they're earning less when there's a buyback. So this is the entitlements purchased by type. Sorry again for that. It was all working before. But as you can see, in the second scenario there, where there's no targets and no budget, there's a lot of high security and general security water sold. And likewise, when there's no budget but you put the low targets in, once you include a budget, there's a lot of supplementary water being purchased. And that's basically because with the supplementary entitlement, you only have to give up water in one state of nature model, but whatever production system you're using, it's going to use water in the wet state of nature. So you need to sell a high security entitlement because it's worth a lot more, and you have to change your production activities anyway when you change your water use in the wet state of nature. And we'll look at the flow to the Coorong because we think it's an important environmental indicator. It serves a lot of purposes in the basin. In the base case, that's what you get. There's zero flows through the Coorong in the drought state of nature. When we spend $6 billion, you get some flows to the Coorong, around 800 gigalitres in the drought state of nature, and more in the other states as well. But when you introduce the low targets that sum up to around 3,000 gigalitres long-term average, you still don't get a flow to the Coorong. If you just set these targets, try and buy it back without, and this is still without a budget, you don't necessarily get a flow to the Coorong, which a lot of people think is an important thing, and they spoke about it in the Basin report as being important as well. So, but with the budget, it induces a higher purchase of supplementary water, and because of the different production activities that are chosen, you do actually get some flow in the drought state of nature, which we think is a good thing, but we may be able to do more. Say we want 500 gigalitres minimum in the drought. We can introduce that anyway, and we increase it there. The only change required when you do that, there's no change in the buyback when you introduce that constraint. So this kind of highlights that you can use a buyback to do a lot, but there might be scope for other management policies to achieve particular environmental targets we have throughout the basin. And looking at the high targets, high budget scenario, there's a lot of water going through the Coorong everywhere, but these are the 7,000 gigalitre sustainable diversion limit amounts, and we're unlikely to ever see that. So based on the historical prices paid for environmental water, it looks like there's a lot of water that can be purchased. And right back in February 2008, when they started doing this buyback, it was oversubscribed from the beginning. They were spending $50 million, and it went like that. But you can also note, even spending nearly $6 billion in scenario 3 doesn't secure flows to the Coorong in the drought state. This is just an indicator of what you need to do. You need to have targets. We need to think a lot about the environment that we want to get, because if you just set a long-term limit and you try and satisfy that, you're not necessarily going to get things that you want out of it. And of course, comparing scenarios 3 and 4, it's clear that with a target specified as a long-term average, there are different ways a buyback can proceed depending on your budget constraint. If you've only got so much money, you're going to be forced to buy low security water, which you might not get ever. And the high targets may be achievable, but it will cost a lot of money, and there'll be need a significant reallocation in program spending, program funding amounts. So this is just water use, and it flows mostly on from the entitlements purchased figure that you saw before, much less water use when you're doing a buyback in all the states of nature there. And it's a similar story there. Wet state there with that $10 billion spending, 13,000 gigalitres of environmental flows, which is much more than we see now. So just talking about limitations and future improvements we could make, we're only using long-term average sustainable diversion limits flow targets as an analysis of the impact of moving to a future with less water and the environment that we want to get and how we're going to get it. We need to go to a more detailed level to really understand the impacts that this is going to have. We've also currently got no prioritisation of environmental objectives, which would aid further with spending the money well that we have waiting to be spent. And as I've noted, the model's only annually calibrated, and following that, if there is some change in the temporal profile of storage and release in the basin due to environmental flows that we want, we can't analyse that yet, but it may be something that we want to look at. And of course, we're not measuring any benefits here. There's no measure of all the additional costs that may be incurred in terms of management by the Commonwealth environmental water holder. I'll kind of run through that so we can finish up, I think. it's important.